I can be heard okay. Hello, everyone. How are we doing? I won't do that thing where you have to applaud your satisfaction, but welcome, everybody. Thank you for fighting through your hangovers to be here this morning. It's early for the automation panel. We're really excited because this is an awesome collection of panelists. Obviously, there's a lot of hype in automation space right now. I want to start off, I think it was, Linden, you said something really fascinating before we got on stage, which is, technically this panel is called, what are we going to automate, what to automate next. But as we sort of get further along in making automation useful, whether or not it's like B2C or something a little more industrial or robotic, the conversation really becomes about slowly discovering what we don't want and what we're not going to automate next and what doesn't become useful to us. Why don't we talk about, let's lead in with like a popular reference point, which is everybody's really excited about bots, but especially bots in the chat space. And Linden, how does that relate to what you're doing in terms of simple integrations? And what do you think of like the hype in that space?
Sure. There's certainly a lot of hype with bots, but I think set aside whether or not like a conversational UI, whether that paradigm is really the right next thing or is going to replace anything. I think what you have to really ask yourself with bots is, aside from perhaps lowering the barrier to interacting with the service, namely not having to download an app, what else can a bot access? What can it actually do? What can it do for you? And I think it doesn't necessarily have those permissions, at least on the surface, to do anything new. Apps had all kinds of things it could access by nature of tying into the operating system on the phone. Bots don't really have that, at least nothing new beyond apps. And so I think that's one of the big problems, and one of the reasons that I think Alexa has actually, it's kind of like a bot. You don't chat to it, you talk to it. Has had a lot of really interesting stories and a lot of traction because it can actually do some things for you. It has access to all kinds of things. And so I think that's going to be one of the interesting conversations that plays out.
So obviously, it's interesting that you brought up Alexa because a lot of when we talk about automation, the home is the hot thing, right? It's always generally interactions between home objects. And we're seeing it like early on with Nest, and we're seeing it with simple if like recipes between objects. Jim, I've talked to you extensively before coming on stage. You've been immensely dissatisfied.
I think that the usability is immensely dissatisfying because we have looked at things from a technology perspective. I mean, simply, the problem that we have today is that technologists create technology. And they speak at a layer that's much more short sentences and dependent upon bandwidth and dependent upon processor. And there's a culture that's been created since the invention of transistor that's created these people that talk at a layer down here, but consumers, and everybody here is a consumer, speaks up here in a natural language. So you have this usability gap. And the challenge, and what you were saying with regards to you're not sure if it's a natural interaction, I think that the problem that I'm dissatisfied with is the usability of technology is still being dictated by technologists. So natural interactions are interesting. Specifically, Alexa opens up this whole app world. But if you think about a bot, instead of being a bot as it's something that automatically accesses and does things for me, instead what it is this new app model. It's a layer of interaction, and it's one of many, right? You can have a bot, you can have physical interface, you can have gesture, you can have voice. All these things can work together and should through a common mechanism.
And I also want to say a big thing. I need you to unpack this for the audience because it's like there's a couple layers here. But like you keep on bringing in augmented reality, which I think is super. If we're going to do like buzzwords, right? If we're going to do bots and robots, and let's go all the way and do augmented reality. A lot of people are familiar with HoloLens, Google Glass is like this. Yeah. Unpack kind of like the augmented reality theory of interacting between objects.
Well, I think that as we move through technology, we've got this convergence, this perfect storm brewing between all aspects that's getting us to mass market penetration with technology. And I think that augmented reality is going to happen. It's happening today. Virtual reality and more importantly, mixed reality, they're becoming a thing. So I think that if you're not planning your technology around anticipating that the information that you care about is actually available, popping up in front of you as you're living your life and able to come to you on your terms without spamming you, then you're not exactly exploring the full reach of things. If you're saying, oh, it has to look good, like 10 years ago, it has to look good on TV. There's a 10-foot and a 2-foot and a 6-foot lean back experience. That was the Microsoft mantra forever. It's very different now because now there's an in your face, and then there's a community and a public and a private. I think that when you think about these technologies, you just have to think about the different perspectives and the different stakeholders that are in these equations.
So, and actually, I want to bring in Andrew, because actually there's a lot of diversity in terms of the spaces on this panel. Andrew, you deal with, oh, sorry, jump in.
Dive in. There's one thing that is a common roadblock that Linden and Jim have talked about, that is what's holding a lot of robotics back as well, and it's interface and interaction. And you mentioned the difficulties interfacing, interacting on more of the technological level, and you mentioned the range of ways that we interact. Now, is anyone here an interaction designer? When did that go from being designing an experience to designing for a screen? Because in the last 10 years, as a career, that's shifted. And I've just been doing a class with interaction designers, and they went, "You're talking about robots. When are we going to do apps?" And I said, well, welcome to your future careers, because there is a whole range of objects that are smart coming into your world, and you're going to need to be interacting with them using a range of ways: gesture, voice, talk. When we talked about chatbot, I mean, messaging is still a far more effective form of using language than verbal language. All of these iterations, and think of the change from 2-dimensional screen interactions to 3-dimensional objects. These are the interactions we need to be designing for, and I think in many ways the technology is further ahead than our ability to turn it into usable, useful products.
Yeah, I'd even add to that. I think one of the broader sense that I'm having, I think a lot of people here are having as well, is just a sense of being overwhelmed. It's as if the Pandora's box of computing, which was an actual box. It was a PC, it was a laptop, it's a phone. It's as if we've opened that, and now the range of ways in which we can interact with services is just exploding. There's not even, I think AR is going to be a fantastic technology, but it's not going to replace, it's going to be like in addition to all these other things. So you can imagine as a business, even trying to keep up with that, the people are just now kind of catching up with like, oh, we need a website, oh, we need an app. And now you've got to now think about the relationship with your customer across 10 new things, 10 new ways of interaction. And I think it's just really overwhelming, not only for consumers, but for businesses as well. So I think I wholeheartedly agree with what you're saying, Andra.
Absolutely. Jim and I were talking yesterday about developing a unified symbolic language. Some of the things that I've seen in some very well-designed robots, a lot of care has gone into what seems to be incredibly simple interactions. So looking at Relay from Savvy Oak, for example, which is the hotel delivery robot, their original robot, it required you to open the lid when the robot delivered things to you. And people had trouble with it. It wasn't necessarily an easy thing. The difference in the experience, when the robot arrives, the lid opens, and it's giving you what's inside. It's quite a different transaction that you're engaged in. But they reduced the complexity of the interaction. They did not bring speech from the robot into it at all, barring in very constrained fashions. You get a phone message. The robot doesn't speak to you. But simple coding like the lights on the base, that's a really important thing for robotics. And sound. Often people have had to add sound into a robot that's mobile so that you know that it's moving if you don't see it. It does something that allows you to be aware of it and allows you to sense its intentions. And we need these cues all the time. And you'd think it'd be really simple to have a unified standard for this is a robot that's moving forwards, backwards, or something, but we can't even agree on what the different colors mean. Traffic lights in different countries have different codes for what the colors mean and what they signal.
So I want to add that I think that part of the challenge we have is our current perspective. When we talk about devices, we talk about interactions, we talk about all the things, what you're actually describing is in my opinion, part of the problem is thinking about it as technology. Done a little bit of writing on the subject of kind of reimagining this. Is instead of thinking about these things as technology, what if you were to put the same constraints that you put on people, and specifically the things that are in your life, and that when you bring them in, you're actually hiring them into your company, the company of you. So if you think about things as employees, right away we see kind of the level of failure that we have, because you want to make sure before you hire somebody that you can trust them, that they're reliable to do the job, and they work well with others. Right away, a lot of the devices in our homes and around our lives fail. You also would never hire somebody when they say, hey, I'm gonna come work for you, but the only way you can talk to me is with this app, right? You can't use email, you can't use any of your social conventions, you have to talk to me in this way. So when you talk about the cues, I think what you're talking about, if I was to bring it into this analogy, is I think you have to educate the technology manufacturers how to put culture and how to put manners into these products. And I think that's really what it comes down to, is you have to imbue traits that are natural for us. Like as we have this conversation and we're making these gestures and the words are coming out, as we're saying these things, there's cues all over the place that are in here that enable us to understand deeper intentions that are there. With technology, it's a lot more complicated.
So, and one of the things I'd challenge you there is a lot, when you keep seeing a lot of automation, new automation services and technologies, I actually have a huge skepticism of usability, right? I mean, a lot of for example, I hate to keep bringing up the chatbots, but a lot of people's problem was just like, this is like AOL Instant Messenger in the 90s. I'm giving binary responses. I'm going shoe shopping with a bot that feeds me 5 shoes, then I click no, and it feeds me 5 more. It's just an absurd way of interacting.
I think no matter what car you buy, it may have automatic wipers, automatic headlights, but there's always a manual override. And I think that always has to be the case. You have to have a kill switch. You have to have a way to take control of something easily and say, that's not quite right. Because if I'm having a conversation with Andra and she disagrees and decides to tell me, no, I'm going to take over, then the society has taught me to, fall back and hear your point. Technology does not do that. Technology is rude because it has lack of information, and in this case, lack of understanding of the cultural implications that it submits itself to. So
because we have brief time, I do want to go down and now go through, there's been so many public failures. Linden, you're one of the few people I think of who runs a business where it's based on automation, and I used it outside of my context of my work in tech, my job. We use IFT in various ways.
Awesome.
But talk to me a little bit about, like, you were talking about, like, it's about services. Is it really just because IFT has the permissions? Is it connectivity? Like, what do you think is the key for automation companies going forward in terms of creating something that people want to use?
Sure. I think it really comes down to, no longer sexy as talking about software eating the world or SaaS. I think, but really that's when we talk about automation, when we talk about IoT, that's still the major driving factor. It's that we are literally wiring up and adding software to every single thing we do. Every noun that we could possibly name over some timeline is going to be controlled and monitored and have an API around it. It just kind of, it is this idea of software in the world. And so when you think about that, back to this idea of being overwhelmed, we're also being overwhelmed by the number of services, the number of discrete, siloed ways in which we've wired up our world, physical or digital. And the thing we think about at IFT, and one of the big usability problems we're trying to solve, is how do those services work together and work for you? When you think about making a meal in the kitchen, you use tens, if not hundreds of different things: countertops, silverware, knives, toasters, ovens. I'm not a big cook, so I don't know what I'm going to make of that. But the idea is that none of those tools did some kind of business development deal. They don't have open APIs. There was never a question in your mind that all of this stuff was going to be compatible and you were going to come out the other end of it with a delicious sandwich. But that's exact opposite of how things work when we talk about services. And I think that's really one of the fundamental problems and one of the ones that we're trying to solve at IFT.
I'm just going to pick up the food theme and say, this is why I'm really excited about agriculture as the area that we should automate next. And it's the area in which I think robotics has the most to offer and in some ways the least to lose. Because if we take Jim's idea that technology needs to be managed, then perhaps the farm is the best place for what is still very rude technologies. So let's put all the rude robots to work on the farm, where they can offend a lot fewer people. And following that through, it's also an area where we're doing a lot of instrumenting already. And we have the potential to instrument a lot more in terms of the infrastructure and in terms of the animals. And if you've ever seen a modern dairy farm set up, you'll understand that cows are really the queens of the quantified self movement. And it can help us see how we start to develop the best practices for a more automated engagement and translate that to our lives.
So I was actually speaking upstairs just a few moments ago to a gentleman who's the CIO of a company that oversees the big agricultural opportunities within the United States, and he was describing how the CIO organization is now managing drones, because they have drones going and managing security of the fields. They're managing the soil and the irrigation. They're managing RFIDs that they're putting in every piece of every bit of livestock that they have. They're managing life cycles. They're managing dietary requirements. So they have actually really used IoT and this ability to actually measure and make actionable movements based on that. So for example, with the drones, one of the things they do, especially in the swampy areas, is they'll go in and they'll scout out and they'll identify through object recognition alligator nests that are in the middle of the fields and in the things, so that they can then deal with that particular problem. So I was actually really surprised to know that a CIO now has to have drone management as part of their IT infrastructure.
So, but right before we wind down, I wanted, since I really appreciate you guys, all the straight talk here. When people talk about automation, constantly we're talking about home, and constantly we're getting examples like, oh, your refrigerator, it's going to know when you run out of milk. It's like the classic one. As a reporter, you always have to lead the story with Internet of Things using the milk analogy so that people know what the hell you're talking about. The refrigerator runs out of milk and it's going to order you another one. Is this still a useful analogy to talk about where we're going, or not? Or is that sort of like time-tested, a public failure, we can move on and think smarter?
We evolve as the opportunities evolve. As sensors increase in abilities, as technology increases in abilities, what we're going to find is we have new app models, exactly like what we had on the mobile phone. The mobile phone is a set of sensors and inputs and outputs, and we're able to build a billion apps around that. We're going to find the same thing with those sensors that are being distributed throughout our lives. And it's not about the home. It's actually, that's where you live and that's where you work and where you sleep, but it's about the consumer. The real thing is, it's not Internet of Things, it's Internet of you. And that's where it comes down.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's like we're building the bits and pieces of a future operating system. It's totally distributed, each one of these services. So your refrigerator knows something about milk, maybe not particularly interesting in its current application, but as that can be plugged into something broader, just like with the phone, it knows your location. No one really conceived of how popular it would be to tag your location in an Instagram photo. That happened later. And so I think as we can wire this new operating system up, a lot of these things will happen. And it's not just to build it and they will come, but it's a process. And there needs to be much more, whether you call it openness or availability, for each one of these services to be accessible by a totally different developer, a totally different team.
Sometimes we really don't see the flaws in those models. The milk fridge model, what ended up happening? Fridge makers weren't very good at milk or delivery. And so now we're more likely to have an Amazon button on the fridge and just go, oh yeah, I want to order that. Or, sorry, the Munchery app on your phone or something like that. But I'm trying to look further down and see where these things can also deliver best social good. And I'm very interested in the idea of reducing the footprint of logistics involved in the production of food and the manufacture of other goods. And I think if we can start to shorten the loop in a lot of things, we can bring back local agriculture, because there will be a better communication between the producer of those strawberries or that milk and the demand in the local area, and connecting that to people who are in the right position to be providing the services.
Okay. Andra, Linden, Jim, thank you so much. Give these guys a hand. Thank you so much for being here, and enjoy the rest of the panels, and thank you.